Welcome, everyone, to our latest in our monthly series of EdSource Roundtables. My name is Ann Vasquez, Executive Director of EdSource. California, during the pandemic, suspended tying funding for its schools to student attendance. As the state emerges from the pandemic, questions remain about how best to fund schools at a time when state demographers project a further drop by 2030, even with a post-pandemic recovery. We have so much ground to cover today during our roundtable discussion and to talk about what the legislature and districts can do to soften the impact of declining enrollment. And lastly, we couldn't be here today and gather today for this type of event were it not for the supporters and our funders at EdSource. A big thank you to the Hewlett Foundation for their support in making today's roundtable possible. Now for our introductions. First, I'd like to welcome State Senator John Laird of Santa Cruz to our panel. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Please also welcome Carrie Hanel, Senior Director of Policy and Strategy at the Opportunity Institute and a Senior Fellow with PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education.
Hi, nice to be here.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erin Simon, Assistant Superintendent of School Support Services at Long Beach Unified School District, and she's also the President-elect of the Association of California School Administrators.
Hello,
Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with each of you.
Please also welcome Holly Sobolski, Director of Elementary and K-8 Schools for the San Juan Unified School District.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And next, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Gina Potter, San Ysidro School District Superintendent.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to join you today.
And also at our roundtable today is Julian LaFortune, a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, and he specializes in K-12 education.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, our moderator today is none other than EdSource Editor-at-Large, John Fensterwald. Welcome, everyone. John, there's so much to cover, so why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Great. Thank you, Ann. So today we'll discuss an issue weighing heavily on districts, the immediate impact of declining attendance, and the immediate and long-term challenge of declining enrollment in many California districts. They're related issues, and they've come to a head during the pandemic, and they have critical implications for students and families and for school districts and charter schools' financial stability. We've assembled a terrific panel with lots to cover in an hour. So we'll spend the first 40 minutes on how to fund schools in post-pandemic, whether by attendance, which California has done for 100 years, or to switch to funding by enrollment, and why the issue is now before the legislature. Then, for the last 20 minutes, we'll explore what districts are doing and can do to increase attendance and enrollment, how proactive strategies can strengthen engagement with students, provide alternatives for families considering opting out of public schools, and also improve their bottom lines. Implausible? Well, stay tuned for the next hour. So first, some numbers and a perspective on declining enrollment from Julian LaFortune of PPIC. Julian, what's the state's projections for the next decade and for declining enrollment, and how might it vary by region?
Yeah, so statewide, the Department of Finance projects a 9% decline over the next decade, and that's through 2030, 31. So that's a drop of about 500,000 kids. So that's the big headline number. But of course, it varies across districts across the state pretty tremendously. And so some areas, for example, in Southern California, have already seen pretty large declines over the past decade or even longer. And in many of those Southern California counties, declines are projected to continue. So LA County, for example, has seen a 12% drop over the past decade and actually projects an even larger decline, about 20% over the next decade. There are other areas that have seen growth in the past decade that are now projecting slight declines, and that includes parts of the Central Valley, many counties in the Bay Area, as well as the Sacramento area. And while most counties statewide are projecting declines, there are some that are actually projecting to see increased enrollment, and that's mainly occurring in the Sierras and in the northern Sacramento Valley. And so, just one example, the state projects about 10% growth in El Dorado County. So that's about 5,000 more kids over the next decade.
So on what factors did the Department of Finance and demographers base these projections? I've heard it's such a big number. I've heard some skepticism that maybe they got the numbers wrong.
Yeah, so there's always uncertainty, but basically what goes into it are data on school enrollments, the number of births, as well as historical trends in migration patterns. And so without going too far in the weeds, basically the projections start with the number of kids at each grade level. The department then kind of projects these cohorts forward using what we know historically. And for kindergarten, that comes from the number of births that we've seen, 5 or 6 years ago. And so because we know the number of births that have occurred over the past several years, because we know how many kids are currently enrolled in the system, I'd say in general, we have a pretty good sense, at least over the next several years, of how enrollment will evolve. Of course, the longer out we go, the more room for error there is. Migration patterns can change. At some point, we rely on kind of, projected rather than actual numbers of births. And then, we have, experienced a pretty profound global pandemic, and there are a lot of changes to migration patterns. There's changes in kind of the rates at which, families are sending kids to homeschool or private school. And so all of those kind of add an additional layer of uncertainty to these projections.
So we've already had because of the pandemic, a drop of enrollment over the past 2 years. So do you have a sense, and Carrie weigh in as well, do you have a sense whether this sort of sped up that projection of 9% or it may be compounding it?
So I can take the first stab at this, and then I'll let Carrie add anything. So basically, when we just look at the projections, the pandemic exacerbated the total magnitude, but that's largely because the declines were kind of greater than anticipated. But once we factor in the kind of pandemic decline from 2019 to last year, 2020, 2021, the projections actually aren't too different in magnitude than those that were made just before the pandemic. So that is to say, it's not so much an acceleration, but really more of this kind of one-time shock that we saw last year, and then projections that are kind of adding on to that lower base of enrollment at kind of a similar rate as we had projected before, but kind of taking us to a lower and lower enrollment level by the end of the decade. And so, it's possible we could see some bounce back here. We're kind of building in this pandemic decline, and I think we haven't seen the enrollment numbers for this school year yet, at least statewide. But it's also possible that some of these patterns, that I just talked about, could accelerate as well. And so, there's reasons there could be kind of larger or smaller over the next decade.
Thank you.
John, I'll just add to that although we don't have enrollment data in for this year yet, we do have the P1 attendance data. That's the ADA data that counts the number of students that were in school up for, through the first semester, essentially. And we saw a loss of about 500,000 students in terms of ADA in that first few months of the school year. It's of course too early to know whether those are unenrollments, whether that's truly enrollment loss or whether that's attendance loss. And we know that some districts are experiencing absenteeism in the 10 to 20% range because of quarantines this year. So there's probably a mix of the two going on, but I would agree with Julian that this is a big shock. It's probably too early to really know what's happening. We're going to need another year of data.
Well, turning to the issue of the relationship to funding, Carrie, you did a study which we've linked to just recently, just out, to looking at the advantages and disadvantages of funding by enrollment and funding based on attendance, which we've done, as we mentioned, for a long time. So whatever attention we pay to this, is it going to deal with the issue of declining enrollment, whichever way we fund schools?
Not really. I mean, if enrollment is declining for the reasons that Julian discussed, or because families are opting out of the public school systems, it doesn't really matter how we count students. It doesn't matter whether we count them as enrolled students or attending students, that number is going down. So making a switch from ADA to enrollment is not a solution to the declining enrollment crisis. It could provide a short-term Band-Aid for some school districts that are really feeling the fiscal pain that comes with enrollment loss, and that's not to be dismissed. So if that's one of the goals of the legislature that could make sense in the short term, it doesn't really buy us a whole lot in the long term. The other thing that I'll just throw out there is, if we are considering other kinds of hold harmless policies, essentially funding students that no longer exist in our school sites. Say we have a district that's dropped from 50,000 students to 40,000 students, and we want to hold them harmless and still fund them as though they have 50,000 students. We're funding essentially 40,000 phantom seats. And that might be an important goal because it does create some fiscal certainty and stability in that school district, but it also comes at a cost. And so I think we need to think about, where do we want to invest any discretionary resources that we have as a state? How can we best address the student needs that have really risen during the pandemic? And is this the right way to do it?
Before we get into that discussion, that's a great topic. Carrie, just to set the discussion, give us some of the advantages and the disadvantages of funding by enrollment and funding by attendance.
PACE report that we put out, and I see it's linked in the chat, which I appreciate. It really looks at these trade-offs. And the point that it makes is that there are benefits that come with making a switch in the count method, and there are also risks and disadvantages. And it's really about just weighing what the goals of the state are and deciding which goals we want to address with this kind of move. I think the advantage is that we could potentially move to a more progressive funding structure if we shifted from attendance to enrollment. That's because we know that absenteeism is highest in our high poverty school districts, and therefore the highest poverty school districts are the ones that feel the greatest fiscal penalties under the current ADA-based system, oftentimes for reasons that have to do with community factors like asthma, transportation barriers, and other things that are outside of the control of the school district. Not to say that the district and the school can't do anything to improve attendance. Of course they can. But that is one compelling reason that advocates have raised for potentially shifting the count method. The other is that districts are funded based on attendance, but they budget based on enrollment. They set up their classes, they buy their textbooks, their Chromebooks, all these other things based on the number of students. You're not going to assume that 90% of your students are there one day and buy 90% of the books you need, right? And so if we want to align our funding with our budgeting, a shift to enrollment could make sense. On the other hand, the fiscal incentive to have students attend school is a real one. You know, it expresses a priority that the state has, that the number one thing that matters is that students are present, because if they're not present, they can't learn. And if we move from attendance to enrollment, we potentially lose an important incentive, although we could argue that, you know, there might be other ways to tackle attendance and chronic absenteeism in the state. I think those are the big ones. There are other things that folks have raised that we can discuss here, but, you know, when we stack up the pros and cons, I think those are the ones that are top of mind.
Yeah, so let me turn to Senator Laird. You've heard the arguments, and where do you stand at this point on that choice, on the issue, and what's your inclination based on what you know?
Well, Julian and Carrie set this up very well, and before you ask that direct question, answer that direct question. There's this whole issue of the funding, and you start back where some of the conversation was about the governor's proposal to do a rolling average to try to hold harmless just in the time of the pandemic and let people choose if they want one higher year. And yet that doesn't deal with the overall declining loss of enrollment, and it might not even keep up some campuses. And our fiscal system is such that the Proposition 98 K through 12 funding levels is based on revenues. It's not based on what's going on the other end necessarily on attendance. And so here we have enrollment that has declined during the pandemic, and revenues have surged. So the real policy question is what to do given that surge in enrollments. And then if you go to the question at hand about average daily attendance versus enrollment, we have a situation where in the governor's budget, based on what the revenues were in January 10th, we have a 5.3% increase projected for school districts in the local control funding formula going ahead July 1st. And it's quite likely that the later revenues that we see in May will take that over 6%. And then we have a number of billions of dollars to decide what to do. And if you were to do the enrollment-based system, switch to it from the average daily attendance system, the PACE report that Carrie and others did shows you need $3.4 billion more than school districts have now, because the average daily attendance is embedded in Proposition 98. And if you had no additional money and you switched, it would just rearrange the money within a fixed pie. And there would be many winners and many losers. And as the report and other things point out, based on, it's more likely that those that have a real higher attendance now would be among the losers, and those that have lower attendance that could really boost with the enrollment would be the winners. And then it's incumbent on us to educate people, because I don't think people understand that. And if we were to do a $3.4 billion addition to move to the enrollment system, there would be some school districts that would be held harmless and would just be where they are now. And I think there'd be a real expectation they were going to move up. And then maybe half of them move up substantially. And we would have to do a lot of education about expectations about what that means. And then if you look at the some billions that we have, and it's divided into one-time money and ongoing money. In the ongoing money, we do have a request for $3 billion for home to school transportation, and you heard Carrie say that transportation could be an issue that affects enrollment. You'd have $3.4 billion you'd have to do this, and some of us want to increase the base funding since we don't think it has kept up with what the expenses are that schools are facing. So then it gets to be a budget competition, and we genuinely have to decide what's important and what we want to do. Because in the ideal world, probably makes much more sense to have an enrollment system, given what was said about preparing for everybody that's there. But in the practical world, it requires billions of more dollars to hold some people harmless. And we have a whole series of choices of what to do to the money. And we should look at what the priorities are that we really think will push schools ahead.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that point, Senator. The fact that just because we want that additional $3.4 billion for covering enrollment doesn't mean that Proposition 98, which is the basis for state funding, increases. It is within that, so it's jostling around. Do you at this point, do you see a need to change?
Well, I think it would be beneficial, but I also think it's, as I just said, in a whole series of choices. And yeah. I think, and I apologize because I know I have to leave a little early to this. And there was a letter that came in from school districts in the last few days saying, we want a COVID bump. Give us a one-time COVID bump with some of the things that are available in Proposition 98. And so then you throw that in the mix, and you throw buying out some of the retirement system and PERS and STIRS into the mix. So what we really have to do is a COVID bump make sense, or does adding a bunch of money to the base funding that makes it go up a number of percent and means it actually recurs in the second and third and fourth year? And is it just a bump? What makes the sense? So we're really going to have to ground truth this, and you know, and John would know this, there's a community college funding formula that was switched 4 or 5 years ago, the student-centered funding formula, the SCIF, and there's been a measure of chaos ever since the change happened. We have been holding harmless a measure of community college districts ever since then, because they would have gone down 9 to 10%, while others went up. And so we've implemented the formula, but we've held harmless the others. And now the governor wants to wean them off of the hold harmless and have significant cuts over the 5 or 7 years. And I think it's really important for all the school superintendents and everybody that's listening that we ground truth this, that we just make sure that there's no surprises when we go into it, so we're not in one of those situations. And we do have some great opportunities and some great choices to make this year.
Yeah.
Senator, I wanted to jump in before I know your time is short. A question from the audience regarding the ADA enrollment, affecting not just K through 12, but also the community colleges as it relates to Prop 98. So would legislation that addresses enrollment and funding also include changes to how we fund community colleges?
Not necessarily, and it's only because of the different way they're funded. I mean, the governor proposed a compact for CSU and UC and for community colleges, even though they're in 198. I mean, Prop 98, he called it a roadmap. And so we have to wait for the data to come in from the individual districts, and then we have to set the percentage. But the real question is if money is available in Prop 98, and it looks like it will, then there ought to be a way to do the same things within the community college system, whether it's a rolling average or a bump in the COLA or other things that we would like to do for K through 12.
Yeah. One other question before we let you go, if you have to go soon, and that is, are you concerned if we switch to funding based on enrollment about the incentives for attendance, getting kids to school? Do you think we'd have to then come up with something else to replace the incentive that's in average daily attendance?
Yes. And I know there's some incentives in some of the proposals in the bill to move to enrollment, but when it's been a fiscal incentive, there have been truancy programs and there have been other things, and school districts really work to try to do it. And if there isn't that same kind of fiscal incentive, even though everybody has an incentive in as many kids being there in as many days as they can, it's just not fiscal in the same way. And so we're going to have to figure out, what do we do to substitute for that, or to provide incentives? Or do you adopt an enrollment thing that maybe has some minor incentives in with it that really try to keep school districts from doing that, so that you can still have that when it comes, because it is a concern, and everybody is talking right now, but they haven't totally weighed in. And I have heard from some of the advocacy groups that they have some concern about some of the truancy efforts or other things going away if there's a switch to an enrollment system, and they just haven't totally weighed in yet.
Yeah, let's get a district perspective. Superintendent Potter, where do you stand in terms of a switch to enrollment-based funding?
Thank you, John, and it's such a pleasure to listen to your perspective, Senator Laird, and also Carrie with your PACE report. Just kind of thinking it through and looking across the country and realizing that there really are only 6 states left that fund public education with attendance versus enrollment. And of those 6 states left, there are about 4 of them at this moment that are contemplating this switch from attendance to enrollment. So the timing and that impetus of what's happening with declining enrollment, and also this tremendous financial fiscal impact of COVID attendance losses last year and this year to school districts, has really brought to the forefront of all of our school districts and the 1,000 school districts in the state of California, how do we meaningfully address this? When I look at the January's proposed budget by the state, and I realize that in the last few months, California has a boost in revenues of about $16 billion. And of that $16 billion, approximately 40% will be allocated to that Proposition 98 formula for public education in California. Indeed, the question that Senator Laird poses is the most poignant question at hand, which is, how does the legislature, our legislative leaders, how do they take that, potentially $6 billion increase, and how do they allocate it to the various needs of education in California for the 6 million students that we represent? Indeed, raising of the base, the LCFF base, is a tremendous need to, at least get our state to the average of per pupil funding in the country, while at the same time, when we look at attendance funding, attendance funded based model, I would have to say that I'm also a proponent of making that switch now when we have these additional revenues to enrollment based funding, because I think it's a nominal increase in student attendance with the attendance models that we have right now. Given that I'm the one, right, I'm the superintendent, and the principals that serve in our district and throughout the state are implementing some of these truancy and very punitive models of attendance penalties to students and their families when they're not at school, and knowing that the majority of the students who are struggling with school attendance are vulnerable populations of children. And it's very difficult in my district, where we have between 25 and 30% of our student population fall under the McKinney-Vento Unhoused Youth or Homeless Act. And I'm saying to these students who are moving from car to car, or who are house hopping and couch hopping, they're different, between homes of relatives and friends, you have to be at school every day. And if you're not at school every day, you're going to have to attend a student advisory review board meeting. I have to say that that's not the system in California that provides a system of support for these families that are so vulnerable and who really need support, and they don't need penalties. These are the very children that need more resources. They need their resources for not only the social emotional learning, but for food and shelters, so that they can have a more stable home life. And they're not always struggling to figure out where they're going to live from day to day. So when I look at it, is it okay for us to continue an attendance funding model that dates back to 1911? I don't know. I think we have a rare opportunity right now with the boom in state revenues to address this in a meaningful way. And I do think that there are many positives to bringing fiscal stability to school districts, to providing greater local control, and really to looking at, is it okay for us to prioritize attendance as a state over student and public health concerns?
Yeah.
So, I think if Kentucky, Idaho, Illinois, and Texas are looking at it today, then yes, this is a very timely conversation for California as well.
Any other thoughts, Senator, before you leave?
I'd make one comment to the superintendent, and that is that I appreciate what she said, and particularly about disadvantaged students. But there's this comparison to other states. It's like, geez, there's only 4 or 6. There's only one that has both Proposition 13 and Proposition 98. And that really, Proposition 98 in good times is doing what we're doing now. In bad times, it's a ceiling on education spending. And Proposition 13 at certain times, together with the GAN limit, might have certain impacts. And my big concern is I was budget chair in the Assembly in the dire times, 2004 to 2008, where we were rationing money, where we were trying to protect schools. And so I always have that little concern out here that we just don't build in everything in such ongoing costs that we're going to have a retrenching. And I'm going to be the one that everybody calls up and says, why didn't you think of that? And so I just think those two propositions do set us apart. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means we have a lot more questions to answer. And we just have some ground truthing for everybody that's on this call to make sure we protect them in those times.
Some other perspectives on from a district perspective, Holly or Aaron, Long Beach and San Juan. What are your thoughts on this issue?
I don't mind speaking. Thank you, John. This in regards to that, I too agree with what Dr. Potter mentioned around just the thinking around the changing of funding, right? I know that, initially there was a conversation around where there are going to be winners and losers, right? There are winners and losers now when we look at districts. And when we look at districts, as Dr. Potter mentioned, who have higher poverty, which is also sometimes correlated with higher chronic absenteeism, which does impact ADA, right? Those districts are already receiving a lesser amount of money for a population that has more needs and needs more supports and resources. So for that reason, I think we need to do better in our system. I think we need to do better, for, all students, number one, from an equitable standpoint, but for those, right, who are marginalized, who are vulnerable, those students who don't have the appropriate staffing, those districts who are in rural areas. My mindset now, and I'm not speaking from a Long Beach Unified administrator perspective, or even AXA, I'm just saying that our students can no longer wait. Our students can no longer wait for appropriate funding or staffing or resources, right? That's going to help them move forward and thrive. Dr. Potter alluded to our homeless population, right? In Long Beach, we have a large population as well, homeless, right? Foster, SES, our percentage is around, 65%. Right. So there's a lot of need in our community. I think sometimes people don't understand that from a Long Beach perspective. They believe that the city is very affluent, and there are some pockets that are affluent, but there are some swaths of our city that need a lot of, resources. When you think about that additional money and what you can do with it, right? The necessary staff that can be inside the school instead of within a community agency, those social workers, those counselors, those mental health professionals, right? All those things can be embedded, even in a community school model where you have nurses and agencies to support students in that way. I agree there needs to be something different. And if we believe, just based on research, and thank you, Carrie and Christina, for writing this wonderful article that I think I read about 5 times last night. I thought it was just amazing, just in how you spoke to the indifferences in ways to think about and brainstorm if it can work. I think it's not going to hurt, right? Even if we pilot something for a year or two, as we are, moving out of this pandemic to see how our kids can have more resources and thrive. I think it's definitely worth the conversation, and I think definitely worth more research to see how we can support our students at a higher level.
Thank you. Holly, San Juan, is it a growing district?
No, we're actually a declining district also.
Some of your neighbors, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on this from your perspective?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more than what Dr. Potter and Dr. Simon have been saying is we have to start thinking about things differently. And I think just like Dr. Potter was saying, now is a great time. We've got an influx of resources. We've got staffs who are willing to think about things differently. And the whole education community has had to do a lot of shifting. And so we're kind of used to it right now. And so it seems like a really good time to be thinking outside of the box and thinking in different ways on how we can serve our kiddos that need it the most. I think we're not quite there yet, and we have to be willing to think about it.
So, Carrie and Julian, what are we talking about? Actually, when we talk about switching from attendance to enrollment, what's the average district getting? What's the average attendance in the state? And so how much money are we talking about? Well, you said 3.4 billion, but what percentage would that increase a district's budget?
The average attendance rate is about 95%. So the ADA is about 95% of enrollment across the state. The interesting thing about that figure is it doesn't really vary that much from district to district. I think there's this kind of myth that there are some districts that have tremendously bad attendance, and that 80%, and some that have tremendously good attendance. The reality is that our very high poverty districts are about 1 percentage point below the average, and our more privileged districts are roughly 1 percentage point above the average. There is not a lot of spread, which raises a question whether the incentive really drives attendance in different directions. So there would be an increase for most districts. We calculated that the average increase would be somewhere in the $300 to $700 per pupil range, depending on the attendance rate of the district and depending on the unduplicated pupil percentage, because of course any increase to the base grant under LCFF also increases the supplemental and concentration grants. So there would be an effect. And when you stack all that up, we're estimating about $3.5 billion, 3.4 billion is what we estimated in additional LCFF spending, not to be confused with additional Prop 98 funding. And I think we've started to talk about this a little bit, but one of the things that I think we need to be really clear on is we can afford, given where Prop 98 is, to put more into LCFF right now if we choose to. There's a choice before our policymakers, in part because the economy has done very well, and in part because enrollment has declined, that suddenly we're in this very strange place of having a lot of discretionary revenue to allocate. About 2/3 of Prop 98 goes into LCFF. We could put $3.4 billion more into LCFF and afford to do that without necessarily having losers. And so I keep hearing this winners and losers point. I just want to be clear that the state is in a rare position where it can afford to increase funding. And we just need to make a choice whether LCFF is going to continue to be the primary vehicle for distributing progressive funding in California, or whether we're going to start to chip away at that by moving money into categorical programs. And that's, that's really a choice for policymakers. But I think I kind of agree with what Dr. Potter said about this being a kind of unusual time where we do have some revenues to play with.
One thing that I'll add, having looked at some of these data myself, Carrie's absolutely right. Most districts actually don't vary too much when it comes to these attendance rates. But where we do see a little bit more variance is in smaller districts and rural districts. And so, there, the impact of students missing a few days can be larger when you have, just much fewer students overall. And that's kind of a bigger chunk of the budget. And so that could provide some of those districts some additional stability as well. But I think what Carrie mentioned, just, kind of bringing this conversation back to these priorities, what are we spending on within Prop 98? Is this extra money kind of going into the LCFF formula or through other categoricals? I think that's really kind of key to this discussion.
John, I did want to jump in just with a question from the audience. Miguel Dominguez asked a question. We've been talking a lot about those districts and those neighborhoods that do have high needs. And so is there a way to maintain attendance incentives without penalizing those districts, those communities that would lose funding depending on the model?
Well, under the current system, one could argue that those districts do suffer the biggest fiscal penalties, that they're already losing money. And so the argument for shifting to enrollment is that it would bring money back to those communities. The question of fiscal incentives is a really important one. There are three major ways that states try to drive attendance. One is through funding formulas like we're talking about today. The second is through compulsory attendance laws like truancy laws, which we've alluded to, which is really about the student and the family, not about the system, right? And then the third is about the accountability and support system. And we haven't talked about that yet. But if we're really serious about improving attendance, we should also be asking how effective LCFF has been through the dashboard, the system of support, that, we've had the chronic absenteeism indicator just for a couple of years now in California. Is that working is a question we should be asking. And then what other kinds of supports can we provide to schools and districts so that they're using data to triage student needs, to use data as an early warning system. So we're really, using the information we have to drive the right kinds of practices. I talked with a lot of practitioners, district leaders, school board members, and so on when doing this study with Christina, who's on the call today. And I think the thing that we have to keep in remember is that educators really want to serve students, right? I mean, you guys can speak to this. This idea of needing to have an incentive and a push to drive attendance is kind of a strange one when really the charge of schools is to serve students. So I think there's a lot we can do.
Just as a reminder of the importance of doing something in the next year, Gina, tell us about your experience in terms of what your attendance. We're supposed to go back next year to status quo, where we've been. And what's been the impact of a loss of attendance in your district this year?
Indeed, the issue of the COVID impact to attendance this year has been tremendous on all school districts. I can speak from the position of my school district and what that impact has been this year. And so, I would have to say that, due to the negative ongoing impacts of the COVID pandemic, districts are experiencing significantly lower attendance rates, both last year and in the current year. In the fall, the Delta variant hit California schools and resulted in a statewide attendance decline of about 9%, according to the California Department of Education. And then when January came around, the Omicron variant caused school student attendance to plummet to a state level low. And in our district, student attendance dropped from an average of 94.12% to all the way down to 80% per day just in the month of January because of the Omicron variant. I can tell you we issued so many independent study contracts only to realize that the students were sick at home or their parent was sick at home, and how were they going to complete these independent study contracts to recoup the ADA attendance, and to not, and to also, more importantly, ensure that there was, we didn't have learning loss during the period of 5 to 10 days required by the California Department of Public Health for a quarantine period or for an isolation period. It just was absolutely devastating. So, while I think there was hope that the independent study contract provisions by the legislature would be a solution, nobody had any idea of the different variants and their impact. So let's speak fiscally. In my district, when we dropped that attendance, and right now we went from pre-COVID attendance in a pretty vulnerable population of 94%. Our attendance actually went up last year when we pivoted to online learning to 95. And this year, so far at P1, ADA, we're at 86.25%. So you could see we dropped negative 7.88%. And I think overall, the state probably dropped about that same exact percentage or a little bit higher, somewhere between 8 and 9%. What does that mean in terms of dollars? If school districts in the state of California don't receive some type of COVID attendance relief for this year's COVID losses, my district with just 7 schools will realize a fiscal loss of $1.7 million. So it's urgent that the legislature provides some type of COVID attendance relief for the current year. It doesn't have to be identical to what was provided last year, but anything to mitigate that fiscal loss, because we're doing our absolute best to not just ensure that students retain their learning recovery losses from last year and don't continue to experiencing those losses from the COVID pandemic, which really is not over yet.
Yeah.
In schools, we don't think the COVID pandemic is over. We are still very much living the COVID pandemic today. And so to be penalized for something out of the control of our teachers and our principals and our staff statewide, I feel like some relief regarding COVID attendance relief is very much needed at this time.
Thank you. So that's sort of set the most urgent, the most drastic consequence would be as you described, and then there's funding by enrollment, which would bring it up to 100%. So somewhere in between, perhaps there's a compromise that the legislature will be considering over the next several months. So let's shift a little bit, because those were pretty dismal forecasts, to perhaps what districts can do to boost their attendance and enrollment, whatever happens here. So we know that the goal is to get kids to show up in school, because that's a prerequisite for student success. So Erin, in Long Beach, you're doing that well. Tell us about the All Here network of schools. What are the strategies that you've been using to engage families and increase attendance?
Thank you, John. So in Long Beach, we've been utilizing what we call the All In campaign for the last 5 years, more so the last 3 years, just based on, funding from the California Department of Education. And with that, we've built a peer learning network to where we've invited folks from Attendance Works to help us look at strategies within our system. So I can tell you, just for us, I think what really helped us at least stay a little strong with our ADA was really finding these strategies for building relationships, right? Implementing these strategies for building relationships. So what are those? Is speaking with our staff and training our staff to welcome our students appropriately, create restorative environments. Our communication with families, right? What that looked like, how we maintained relationships, during COVID, and then our outreach efforts just kind of as well. And when I speak to really the restorative environment, We worked on having orientations or virtual school tours. We had personalized calls. Many of our principals were text messaging many of our families. We had positive messaging on campus, and then easily accessible information for our families at our school. When we talk about our outreach efforts and opportunities, right, for students, those weekly individual check-ins, peer check-ins, mentoring, which we know based on research can be very effective. Porch visits, we still canvassed and went to communities and had conversations with our families. Those virtual in-person check-ins with staff, those parent groups with our communities, canvassing the community. We have to understand the communities that we serve if we're going to help them appropriately. That is super important for our district. Sharing our message with the community partners, and then also working alongside our community partners to build these events and also be a part of those events as well. So with that, with the All-In, we added in some social workers, new social workers. We added in identified and specified counselors who did a lot of the canvassing and working with our families individually. We work with a company called Everyday Labs to really help us with nudge letters that we felt were more positive in nature and not punitive, to encourage our families to connect with our school sites and things of that nature. And then we really hinged upon tiered levels of supports. That was instrumental for us. So what are we going to do when those students miss 1 or 2 days of school? What happens at that next level when they miss 3 to 5? And what happens at that top level, potentially, if they miss 5 to 10 days? And which staff we're going to connect with those families and those students, right, to have conversations around it. But amid this pandemic, and I'm going to start right there, John, it was very important for us to ensure that we had relationships. And it also taught us who we built trusting relationships with, right? Because those were the families who are continuing to connect with us and have conversations with us as well.
Yeah, thank you. Can you point to data to compare the attendance either before and after the program, or somehow between comparable schools that didn't have the program and the ones that do through the network, to show that, in fact, this is working?
Yeah, so even for us, if we look at even our All-In schools, and that's about 26 schools, I failed to mention how many schools were involved in that. And those 26 were, right, our high poverty, the highest vulnerable schools in our district that we chose, and we chose those schools for a reason, to show that you can move the needle if you do all these great strategies and provide these interventions of support, and you're less punitive and you inform and educate your families. And so for us, if we look at 2017-18, just to be specific, our All-In schools, our chronic absence rate was 13.53, the non-All-In schools 9.87. As a district, our chronic absence rate was at 12.5. 2018-19, those All-In schools, 15.8. The non-All-In schools, 11.42, but district-wide, the chronic absent rate was 14.6. For 2019-20, and that's when we, hit school closure around March, the All-In schools ended at 13.5, the non-All-In 10.7, but district-wide, we were at 12.5. And then for last year, for 2021, we ended high, of course, because of chronic absenteeism, quarantining, and things of that nature, and the anxiety that came with COVID, and that's still with COVID. A little high at 18.4 for our All-In schools, 13 for our non-All-In schools, but district-wide, we were at 14.5.
Great.
Although those numbers seem a little bit higher, especially for All-In, I just want to emphasize the point. If we did not have those strategies, if we did not have the intentional and specific staff, the chronic absence rates, we believe, would have been a lot higher, and more students would not have been in school. So I am grateful for those strategies and interventions that we put in place to help our families.
Yeah, and it is a family and a student strategy. I mean, we talk about the ADA and the money, but that's the most important thing, the impact you have. We'll see if we can come back to this in a minute, but I did want to turn to Holly. When I think of homeschooling, I assume that it's about parents who are cutting ties with a school district and going off on their own, or maybe to an online charter school or something else. But that's not true necessarily in San Juan. San Juan offers homeschooling, and through 8th grade, and the district actually receives a tuition for that. So tell us, how does that work?
We have had a homeschool program here in San Juan, both pre-COVID. We survived through COVID with our homeschool program, and it's still going strong. So we work with families. We pair families with a teacher that checks in on them and helps them lesson plan, helps them pace, is very much a partner in the process. But the teachers are not the primary teachers. It is the parents at home. So it's definitely a partnership, and it's a true village. We do operate under the independent study legislature. So that's how so there is opportunity for daily interaction with their teachers. And then there's also time with office hours, and there's time with synchronous instruction. So there's a lot of different ways for them to interact with their teacher on a daily basis. But they do get individualized attention with their teacher once every 2 weeks or so.
So how big is it? How big is this program in your district? And why is it that parents would go through you as opposed to going off on their own or through a charter?
Pre-COVID, our program was at about 75 students, so it was pretty teeny tiny. And then within COVID hitting, we exploded up to 875 students. And so that was quite the adjustment for our program. And it involved a lot of a lot of shucking and jiving, I guess you could say. And now we're sitting down in the 200 range.
Do you see it growing after the pandemic, or is it just a pandemic spike?
I think we're going to hover around this 200 range. We do have families who are still very worried about vaccine mandates. They're still very worried about masks one way or another. And then we also have families who have just found that this is a really wonderful way for them to experience school with their students and then still be able to partner with our school district.
I mean, they get the curriculum of the district, right? They have that knowledge. It's the sound district curriculum. Am I wrong?
No, you're correct. We have a really strong partnership with our teachers union. And so we have really worked together jointly and created a really strong program that does use our board adopted curriculum. It just is with the parents being the primary teachers.
Can suppose they change their minds. Can they go back to a district school?
Yes. And in fact, we this year have been able to retain their seats for them at their preferred school of enrollment. We are a district of choice. And so we families are able to choose which school they attend. And we have been able to save their seats for them at their schools. And so there has been a really lovely, seamless transition in and out of our programs as families see fit.
I was just going to try to squeeze in another question from the audience. And I think this was a reference to something that Dr. Simon had mentioned about social workers and hiring social workers. It seems like there's that shortage is ongoing. So how have you been managing to do that? And is there any concern? And I guess this goes for Holly as well, in terms of trying to, some of the changes that have been made amid the pandemic with the extra funding. Is there a concern about what happens when that funding goes away? And how are you, planning for that?
For social workers, I think for us, we have a great relationship with Cal State Long Beach here within our community. So for us, it has always been somewhat, I guess, easy, if you will, to bring in social workers, whether they're MSW first year or second year. So that has been great. Am I concerned with what's going to happen, right, when this funding dries up? Absolutely, right, because we've been blessed just with the additional funding for at least the next 2 years, right after this year. But after that, there is some very strong concerns, right, that I'm sure that even Dr. Gina Potter can speak to, and also Holly, about how are we going to sustain, right, with the workforce and the employees on behalf of the students that we serve. So absolutely, that is a true anxiety of mine that I'm still feeling, right now in anticipation for the next 2 years.
Let's squeeze in one more option, and that is in San Ysidro School District. Gina, you've actually used the COVID money to start and continue next year a virtual learning academy, which is different from independent study. So tell us briefly what it is, who it serves, and why it might become an option in the future post-pandemic for parents who are attracted to that.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. And I'll just do a shout out to Dr. Simon and Holly. Woohoo! I mean, you and your teams are such an impressive job at reaching out to students and their families, showing care and compassion, giving them options for success. I mean, thank you. In terms of our district, a special thanks to the legislature and shout out to them with this one, because school districts this year had the option to provide distance learning and to continue those online programs for the current year because the pandemic has not yet finished. My district's governing board members and educational leaders immediately this past summer created a robust virtual learning academy. We call it the VLA Academy, which is now successfully serving almost 300 students, or about 6% of our total population. To give you a sense of scope, the average size of an elementary school in California is about 600 students. So it's about half the size of a whole school. Where we're proud that the instructional quality and integrity of our VLA program far exceeds the minimum requirements of Assembly Bill 130. And what I mean by that is that every student enrolled in the VLA Academy receives a full instructional day of live interactive instruction with a certificated, highly qualified teacher. Each student's placed in a virtual learning classroom with other students. So every single day, they also have daily interaction with their peers. And each classroom teacher provides the identical district adopted rigorous grade level curriculum that our students who attend school in person receive. They navigate their online world of learning through a Google Classroom portal that's created and developed by their teacher. And that portal serves an incredible instructional resource for our students, as it houses everything from classroom and homework assignments, instructional resources, grades, instructional videos, live links, and more. So, again, I would just say a big shout out and thank you not only to the legislature for this opportunity this year, but also to our extremely hardworking Virtual Learning Academy team in our district, from our assistant superintendents, cabinet members, teachers, and principals. So we're really, truly proud of this program. Of course, like Dr. Simon, how do we continue to fund it? Because it's funded out of federal COVID one-time relief funds. And those funds in the near future are going to be expiring. So, how do we take these wonderful programs we created from social emotional learning, social workers, counselors, extra support, and continue them? And even the virtual learning academies, those all are great programs for students.
Just to clarify, SB 130 is the independent study law that the legislature created, and your program exceeds the minimum requirement for contact with teachers by far. Yeah, and I guess the answer to your question, and maybe correct me, all three of you, is that if it's in the demand, if parents want this option in significant numbers, and if you're able to continue in Long Beach because it's showing that, in fact, attendance rises, and with that, at least under the current system, there's more revenue to justify it. I mean, if it's responding to a parental demand, and if it's there, am I incorrect? You'll be able to sustain this to some extent. Somebody answer.
That's our hope.
Okay. Well, with that hope, Anne, I will turn it over to you if there are any last minute questions. If not,
absolutely. I would love to thank all of you, both in front and behind the scenes today, who have made this conversation really possible. If you look in the chat, it's been a very lively chat and lots of questions being answered live, both on screen and behind. Thank you all to our panelists. Obviously, lots more to come, a lot of questions still unanswered, and EdSource will always be there to facilitate that conversation and explore further. And thanks again to our supporters and the Hewlett Foundation for making the roundtable today possible.